Good morning. All right, so I think everyone knows who you guys are, but give us the 10, 20 seconds and give us the story of what your role is now, where you've been at with your companies.
I'm MARC, president of Zuora. Been in the company a little bit more than 3 years, and I'm responsible for all the field organization. It's really from demand gen down to the customer success.
Great. Dave?
I'm Dave Girard. I'm the CEO of Upstart, which is an online lending company, fairly well unrelated to the topic at hand, but I was at Google and began the Google SaaS business called Google Apps, which has changed and grown, but was there for 8 years until 2012.
I'm Dan Levin. I've been around the Valley for too long to count. First 15 years of my career, I did the 1 to 100 thing at least 2 or 3 times, including at one company that I founded. Then I ran about a third of Intuit, and we had a bunch of internal businesses that we grew through this phase there. I joined Box when we were about $5 million 7 years ago. I'm responsible, as Aaron would put it, for the present, and he's responsible for the future. I run the business day to day. All the people in the business report to me. I work for Aaron. And we just finished a $398 million year, so 5 to 400 basically at Box.
Great. All right, so each of you guys are responsible for some amazing successes of the companies. And I know Box has become a tremendous success. Dave, I know you were part of Google when you took that from not just 1 to 100, but 1 to 1 billion. So maybe we'll get to that in next year's conference, how to go from 100 to 1 billion. And Mark, I know the tremendous success firsthand that you've been part of at Zuora. So the danger is that it can just look so easy in hindsight, what you guys have done. So let's start off with the hard stuff. Give me some stories, and I'll start with you, Dan, and then we'll work our way down. Give me a sense for what are some of the biggest challenges you had to face along the way, or things you had to overcome from that initial, hey, we think we found product market fit, we've got some sales, we're starting to take off, to even getting to that first critical 100 million in sales benchmark. What are the biggest challenges that you had along the way, Dan?
It's super entertaining because I work with a bunch of young people who've never had another job, so they think this is normal. Like, this is what happens to everybody. I sort of liken it to that moment when you're riding the horse and you've been kicking it and it won't really move, and you're sort of plodding along, and then all of a sudden the horse decides it's going to run and you're holding on for dear life. And that's what you want to feel in this phase. The hard part should be keeping up with the growth. And the challenges that we had were really around developing new go-to-market motions. So we had been an inbound-oriented company selling mainly to small businesses. We had to build up a field sales organization, and that was very challenging. We failed twice at doing that before we sort of found the formula. It was very challenging to expand internationally without disturbing our culture. So we now have 10% of our workforce is in London, for example, and building out that international infrastructure was really challenging. And then just dealing with all the cultural implications of the very rapid growth. How do you hire quickly without screwing up your values, all that kind of stuff.
Great. Dave, you want to give some thoughts on Google?
Sure. I mean, building a business at Google is obviously very different in a lot of ways, some enormous advantages. So the first recommendation I'd have if you want to build $1 billion business is be at Google. So I don't compare it to building a startup from scratch to $1 billion, which is a very different notion. But I think it's fair to say that in retrospect, it always sounds wonderful. In retrospect, it is wonderful. You look back, but generally the day-to-day is absolutely terrible. I mean, frankly, it was always disaster of the day, if not 3. I mean, and my disasters were unique in the sense of, wow, we just lost 10 engineers who are going to work on some other product elsewhere at Google. So we had my biggest challenge, frankly, was convincing Google that this was a worthwhile endeavor. And with the hardest part being that the other choice was essentially AdWords, the most probably lucrative business in the history of capitalism. So if you want to describe an innovator's dilemma, try to convince them that charging businesses $5 a month per user was going to be a giant business, and that was sort of like my daily challenge at Google.
First of all, overnight success, it's really a fairy tale, for sure. So before joining Zuora, I thought that I had a lot of experience and I can deal with any type of challenge. I helped a company to scale from 150 million to $1 billion, work in 7 different countries. And my first experience managing a large organization was in Japan. I was 30 years old, and I had people, you know, on average age, probably 40, 50 years old. I had a lot of challenges. Moving to Zuora, I said, I've done it. There is no reason why I couldn't do it. And it should be a pretty easy challenge somehow. And it's difficult. It's really difficult. It's every day it's a challenge. And I believe the mindsets that's to best describe somehow how you should deal with that. You should be in a constant iteration. Every input you get from your team, every input you get from your customer, every input you get from the market should really help you to diagnose the situation where you are at, and then, you know, assess basically what could be the solution, and be in the constant iterations from the market fit, demand gen, from your sales organization, product feedback. This is a daily work. That means there isn't one single time, if I look back to the last 3 years and a half, where I could say that I have been in a comfortable situation or in high confidence situation where I can say, we got it right. So this is really the mindset. And then you have the breakthrough. When you start to see the sales organization, when you start to see a high repeatable sales process, and you start to see a messaging really that is really hitting the customers, then it's, this is the right time for you to start to think about how can I scale now? How I can really, you know, add fuel somehow in the engine here and start to scale.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that the learning continues all throughout this process. And the pivoting or evolution, there's this idea that you find your business model and great, we hit it, and now you just take off. And that's absolutely not the case, almost never. So, you know, Mark, and then we'll go down, you know, what were some of the things that Zuora had to learn or adjust or pivot along the way, either in the product positioning or the target market that you're going after, or what's the right sales model to go after this, where something wasn't working, or you found a sweeter spot venue here, and that helped enable that acceleration?
It's really an evolution somehow. It's a process, because as I said earlier, every really time of the lifetime of the company, and every time you try to do something, you have to be prepared that it's going to be new. Starting from SaaS cloud companies, try to move up. Moving up markets, it's a different set of complexity. Yeah. And every time you think that you have the minimum viable product that is really working with 100, 200 customers, but when you try to move to a different vertical market, a different country, it's really coming with really a lot of set of challenges there, and you have to be really somehow to deal with that. I believe the most difficult one, I will say it's probably the try to find out the right formula here to be able to scale. And we are really a data-driven company in saying here, if you want to scale, you have to think about that like you bring a new salesperson, you give to that salesperson a patch. You need just to make sure that everything else is really all set to enable that salesperson to be successful. This is how you can really gain that level of velocity in the business, from the demand gen organization, the sales engineer organization to support, the global services, the partner. I believe the demand gen, the way you should be thinking about that, you should think about the demand gen as the organization that can help you to really scale, and you have to think about that all time forward. And saying, I have 10 salespeople today, how I can really dimension my demand gen organization for 20 salespeople, so that when you will add the 11, the 12, you have the pipeline ready for that salesperson to be able to scale. I would probably characterize the demand gen as probably one of the most difficult challenges to deal with.
Yeah. So, I mean, knowing Zuora's experience firsthand as an investor and board member, I know you've faced companies coming up from the bottom in that space, and they're obviously bigger guys, Oracle and SAP at the top. In general, for SaaS companies, do you think it's easier to move up market and go after bigger customers, or is it easier to scale down and come from the top and go below?
At Zuora, we started from the small companies. I believe it's depends on the stage of the company. Scaling from 1 to 2 to 3 to $20 million in revenue, annual recurring revenue, small companies can help you to get there. Then to keep basically the level of scale and growth that you need, the 40 or 50%, you need the large accounts. You need companies that can spend 6 digits or 7-digit deals to enable you somehow to grow at the speed that the market is really looking at you to grow if you want to be, considered as a great company. So I believe moving from small to large organizations, it's really coming with a different set of complexity there. Sales process is much more complicated. You used to have 1 or 2 buyers in small companies to 5 or 6 different buyers. You used to compete with almost small companies like you. Now you are competing with the Oracle and SAPs of the world. So it's a really different set of challenges.
Yeah, but one that you have to undertake as you go up. Yeah, it's hard to feed the army by hunting squirrels.
It's exactly that. It's exactly that.
Dave, you want to give us a sense for the time at Google? And I know you had to fight 2 fronts, right? You had to fight how do I grow within this very large organization, but also the external market. Were there things that you had to learn or adjust along the way that weren't working and you found a better way either in product or target market or approach go-to-market?
Yeah, I think as with a lot of companies, focus is always a challenge. And of the many things Google is quite good at, focus would not make the list. So, I think there were definitely a sense that it would be normal and standard to go after the smallest of businesses. It obviously totally depends on your product. We had a product that gets adopted wholesale by a company or not. It was led by Gmail, right? So you moved to Gmail or you didn't. And so we didn't have the sort of land and expand notion the way a lot of companies do. So when you put that aside, you kind of say, okay, what do we go after? And I never felt that we should just penetrate small businesses and take years to move up. We just didn't have that time frame at Google, and it just, But it was important to find ways to focus, and for us it was understanding, who was a candidate and who wasn't. So just a simple, our world was in many ways very simple. We were going after installed Exchange or IBM email that was archaic. So if somebody was on a brand new version of Microsoft, we just didn't waste our time. If they were on some archaic version or some other sort of open source or God knows what sort of email system, great. It was perfect. And it didn't actually matter what size the company was. So for us, focus was kind of a psychographic profile and a little bit of like what infrastructure they had. It wasn't about size of company. But that was always a challenge. And I sort of feel like over time you developed a sense of when you had a candidate company that was likely to move, they had the right representative who could advocate for it. They had the right DNA. There were some other, if they were using Salesforce, for example, that was great. They at least weren't at least horrified about the cloud, which in that day, most people were horrified with the cloud. So there was a lot of ways to qualify and create focus. And that event, was relatively successful.
Great. Dan, you want to share some stories on what you guys had to go through to find that sweet spot? Obviously in an environment where you had amazing acceleration in business growth, but where did you have to pivot or adapt along the way?
I think the challenges you face are really dependent on sort of the nature of the business. There are some businesses where once you've got product market fit and you've got a go-to-market motion that works, it's just a question of scaling it out. The restaurant business is like that. Once you've got one store that works, you just need 1,000 stores just like that. It wasn't like that for us. We were moving on many dimensions at the same time. One of the amazing things about SaaS as a delivery vehicle is you can deliver the same technology to companies of different sizes very easily. And we were growing up market very quickly. So I very clearly remember the day when we did our first $50,000 in annual recurring revenue deal. Today we routinely do deals of over $1 million. So that was changing, which meant the product was changing. We were thus having to change our go-to-market motion from first an inbound web self-serve motion to an inbound over-the-telephone motion, and eventually to an outbound field-based motion. And that was happening at the same time. And as I said, we had 2 false starts there. We had a bunch of false starts on the product side where we just made mistakes. And then we had to expand geographically at the same time, because as we were developing our go-to-market motion in the US, we then wanted to take it globally. Luckily, we did not have any false starts there. And I really think international expansion is one of the great pits of quicksand that young companies can stumble upon. So I just like, I mean, we made a lot of mistakes. And, you know, this whole idea that it's all our fault, you know, like we're the cause of the success of our businesses is complete horseshit, right? I mean, better to be lucky than smart. Better still to be lucky and smart. But, you know, as they say in real estate, right place is the only thing that really matters. And I think each of us chose markets that were very ready to tip. And that makes a big difference. I've been in businesses that were not ready to tip, and it's a very, very hard slog.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I just can add one thing here, back to your question, Craig, about the sweet spots. It's a tough question somehow, because when you have market fits, most of the company want to go in all directions. And I agree with Dan, that in most of the companies, when you are an inbound company, you have a tendency to take any call and try to sell to any company that wants to buy your products. Yeah. It could be a distraction. And I believe being capable to make some tough decisions, saying, I know what is my ideal customer, someone that I can acquire in a highly repeatable way, that I can make successful, they can buy more, and stay there and dominate that kind of customers, and then move to the second one, third one. It's really a tough choice. It's really a tough decision at the end of the day. Yeah. But this is probably the right solution. In the other hand, what I like as well, and I have the tendency to say that, you need to push your entire organization outside their comfort zone. And there is what I call negative friction and positive friction for me. A positive friction is being capable to acquire a customer that will challenge your product organization, will challenge back the way you acquire that customer, demand gen. This is how you evolve as an organization. But you have really to choose it carefully so that you can move one step at a time. Mm-hmm.
Was there some point along the growth curve for you guys where it seemed like, got it, now the gears are clicking and now is the time when we should step on the accelerator? Or does it always feel like, I don't know, we try a little bit more, we go a little bit, when you go a little bit faster? You know, I think there's this magical view, which maybe sometimes happens, where you do a lot of that hard work and then it clicks. And you go, okay, this is the time, everyone buckle in, we're taking off, and you know, we raise the capital, we grow the sales force out as fast as we can, and we build it. Obviously, the danger is getting that false positive on that signal, and then you just crash. Did it feel like, you know, for each of you guys, somewhere along the line, there was this point where you know it when things are working, and you should wait to hit that inflection point and then step on the gas? Or does it always feel hard, and you just have to shift one gear at a time?
The way I always have tried to build businesses at Google or in my current business is sort of picture where you'd like to be in a year or two and what it feels like to be there, and you just sort of imagining everything's easier, it's flowing, it's working, and then you sort of look for signals that you're getting there or how you get there. And I can remember a couple of times where I might have felt that for about 10 minutes. Literally, it was like, hey, this is really working. Wow, this feels good. And it was like punched in the face 10 minutes later with something. So to be honest, you know, I never felt it in all the going from nothing to $1 billion. I never felt like, wow, we just have so much momentum. I think the next 9 months are just good. We're awesome. I can just sort of feel good. You know, Jess Lee, who CEO of Polyvore, wrote this thing about how in startup world, happiness is the first derivative of success. And it's true. It's like no matter what you got, oh, we reached like $10 million a month or whatever it is, whatever that thing is, you're happy for about 5 seconds. And then you're inevitably just, you know, something bad happens, or even if it doesn't, it's not even bad things. You just need more good things. So you're constantly in this state of, you know, especially when you're sitting, I mean, any startup has this, but when you're sitting next to this enormous, crazy, successful business, it gets a little more intense that way, where it's like, you know, $100 million business, that sounds pretty good, except, you know, Google just grew proportionally and is now a $5 billion business, and then it was, you know, the same story. But I think that's the nature of being in startups, is you have to buckle in and realize, like, it's only fun when you look back. That's just the reality of it.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
Okay, but we're not talking about fun, right? We're talking about success. And as I said, I've done this phase probably 6, 8, 10 times if you include businesses that were sort of nurtured in my organization. And I've felt it 2 or 3 times. And there's a real difference, 100%. I mean, I remember at Replay TV. So Replay TV, notwithstanding the fact that TiVo is still standing and Replay isn't, was the first company to launch a device that allowed you to easily record television onto a hard drive and then watch it later. And we put that product out there, and it was like somebody had turned on a vacuum cleaner. Like, everybody wanted one. The idea that you could record television easily onto a hard drive instead of a VHS tape and watch it whenever you wanted to was so compelling that it was like there was this amazing sucking sound of demand. Now, we couldn't figure out the business model. I've been in many other situations where we never hit that inflection point. At Box, I think there were a couple things. One was the iPad. So the idea that you wanted access to your content on the iPad and then on your phone was a really powerful motivator to want to use a cloud content management system. And the other thing was, again, it was one of these things where it's like, we used to talk about this at Intuit a lot. TurboTax was the canonical example. I don't know how many of you are old enough to have actually done your own taxes, but a product so compelling that you cannot imagine going back to the way you did it before. I remember feeling that way about TurboTax. I did my taxes with a pencil on a piece of paper, and then I went to TurboTax, and I was like, over my dead body, am I ever going back to a pen and paper? I think at Replay and also at Box, we had that kind of thing going on. Like, I have been in moments where I'm on the train and I whip out my iPad and it's connected to the cellular network and I can edit my presentation using Office 365 version of PowerPoint on my iPad because I'm 10 minutes away from having to give this talk. And I'm like, how do people live when they can't do this? That creates a lot of demand. And when you find yourself sort of stepping on the ground and the ground falls away because it was actually like a false covering and you fall, that's the feeling. It was like we're falling into a hole. I remember looking my VP of sales in the eye and saying, you understand you are about to sign up to generating $10 million in new annual recurring revenue next year. Do you really think you can do that? Can you hire the salespeople? Can you build the capacity, put the organization in place? And he looked at me and he said, it's going to be no problem. And I think we did 12. And when that happened, I was like, holy shit. I better buckle up because it's going to get really crazy. So yes, it happens. I've only had it happen 2 or 3 times. I remember there was one product at Intuit where we had that feeling of like, oh yeah, like, we just it's like hitting the golf ball with the sweet spot of the club. It just feels different than shanking the ball.
Yeah, I believe it's probably one of the most challenging experiences at Zuora, but one of the most rewarding experiences as well. Back to calendar year 14, I believe, calendar year 14, we did great, double the bookings. And everyone was feeling extremely great. We raised tons of money. I said, this is the time. We can scale. And we hired a lot of people. And the same question, RM team, how much are we going to do? And I had the CFO team, the CEO of the company, how much we should be doing next year? And we were almost planning to triple the numbers. And we felt good that we can do that. So we started really to hire a bunch of people to do that. And everyone were really trying to step on the gas. And after the first quarter, we really hit a wall. That means we hired those salespeople, and back to the demand gen that I was talking about before. I believe it's a combination of a lot of things. I'm saying this is probably the hardest time for me as a leader to see those people join us and not being capable somehow to make them successful. But it was the most rewarding experience and potentially a defining moment in the company history because we really work extremely hard. We step back, we slow down, and every time that we had those bumps on the road was a fantastic learning. What doesn't work? Demand gen, the messaging, the value proposition. And we did all that work. We spent probably 6 to 7 months, weekend included there, trying to really dissect somehow the entire process, how we can scale the organization. And really we benefit a lot from that year. That year was probably the most difficult one, but the most rewarding year. And that year helped us to be where we are today. Yeah. So those difficult moments, don't take them as difficult moments. It's really a fantastic learning. And back to what I said earlier, you have to iterate all the time. That means every challenge, every problem, it's a fantastic opportunity to learn and try to do it better.
Yeah, that's very true. And I remember those times. There's a corollary between an acceleration of learning
Yeah.
driven by an acceleration of pain.
You have to be very data-driven. You have to be super data-driven and listen hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But when you hit those bumps in the road, it makes you question things that otherwise might have just felt like a little turbulence. And you're like, oh, wait a minute. Why are we getting that friction? Why is this aspect not scalable? Because you're going to hit that later than when you do reach that much faster growth stage.
I agree with you, and it's not only solving that problem. You have to imagine that you have people that are relying on you. That means you create doubts. Even if you know that you can overcome that and you can be successful, you have a bunch of people in the company that are looking at us and saying, wow, this company is really slow down. This product doesn't work. And you need to be able to manage the people and the organization. You need to have very good communication to the people. You need to be open and direct. You have to leverage everyone in the organization to be a part of the solution, not the problem. It's managing the people during those difficult times. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. And I believe the communication and the trust can help you to overcome that.
Yeah.
So, good learning.
Great. So in a couple of minutes, let's open it up to the audience to take a couple of questions, but I'll do another round for you guys. So all of us have a little bit of gray hair, having been through some of this stuff. Now imagine we can go back and we can tell our younger selves something at the beginning of this growth path, and you can say to your younger self, Dan, Dave, or Mark, what if you don't do this? Or remember to do this. What advice would you give to your younger self at the beginning of that growth curve?
Well, I'll just say a quick one that I think is, for me, was I needed to do a better job of convincing the company at Google that this was worthwhile and long-term would be enormous at a time when it looked not relevant to this giant growing business. But that aside, because I don't think that's that relevant, I think the single biggest thing I have learned that I would pass along to my younger self is to fight the complexity as absolutely hard as you can, particularly in enterprise technology, because starting with the product, the usual thing of large customers and everybody else pushing complexity into your product and trying to serve every 2% of users who have different needs, that's part of it, and maybe that's the obvious one people know, but the organizational complexity, how your sales teams are structured, how sales teams are comped. Everything about enterprise business is pushed toward real challenging complexity that really ultimately becomes inertia and slows things down. Hard to bring new people on because they take 3 months to understand the price list, things like that, right? So I think if there's anything I've learned is it's the CEO's job more than anything to just realize you have to say no to a ton of things, and that the simplicity is a feature of every part, whether it's, again, product, organization, compensation, no matter what you want to get. Like, simplicity is a feature, and you should fight like hell for it as much as you can.
Yeah. So I know with the Google experience, you guys went after and tackled small market, middle market, and large enterprise. Would you do that again? Obviously, it multiplies the complexity from a product and go-to-market perspective. It also allowed you guys to get eventually from $1 to $1 billion in sales.
Yeah, I would do it again. I don't, like I said, I mean, think of, if you thought about the large enterprise sector and are we ready for it, this and that, there's always, if you're smart about not overdoing it and picking the right ones, you're going to get those big wins that have a halo effect early. And frankly, 95% of that market's not ready for you and you're not ready for them. But as long as you find the right 5%, I think it's a great thing. And I think if you are selling to small, medium, large businesses, it's really important that you set up a system that's not rigid. You don't create like 2 separate companies or 3 separate companies that all have totally different needs. So I think there's a lot of elegance in how you do that. But I'm not one, I mean, as much as it sounds like, startup 101 to focus on one small part of the market and grow from there, I'm not personally a believer in that.
Yeah.
Simple of a model.
Yeah. Okay. How about you guys? Advice for your younger selves?
I believe the people at the end of the day, it's about the people. We are in really extremely extensive human capital business. And whatever how big the company is, surround yourself with the right people is really the key. As I said before, because it's not going to be easy. You need really people that can be on your side, people that can really roll up the sleeve and help you to fight. I believe the people, it's potentially the most difficult. You can have the best product in the world, the best fit in the world. Your ability to have the right people and help you to scale the organization is probably the most critical success factor. Yeah.
I would reinforce that. I'll give you 3 quick ones.
Yeah.
The first is, this is a very challenging time for your leadership team. Making sure that you hire people who can do the job 2 years from now, which is 4x the size, but are still capable of rolling up their sleeves, as Mark says, and getting the job done today is really important. And I was in this constant do loop of, do I have confidence in this leader? Will I have confidence in them in a year? If not, what's my plan? And I've got to sequence this, because you can't flush your whole leadership team all at once, or everybody will be on pins and needles worried about their job. So how are you going to manage that transition? That was a big one for me that I could have done much better. Second thing is, you can't grow if you don't have sales capacity. I know it's obvious, but it takes time to ramp salespeople, even inside salespeople. If you don't have quota capacity, you can't make your nut. So you gotta have your eye on that ball. And the third thing, and I just feel really strongly about this, especially recently, you know, we are a tool-using creature. We have opposable thumbs. You're allowed to use tools to manage your culture, to create the culture and values that you care about. Be intentional about it. Be purposeful about it. If you want a diverse, inclusive, fast-moving, cooperative, anti-political, anti-hierarchical culture, which is what we wanted, use tools to make sure intentionally and proactively that you build that culture so you don't get yourself into the kind of trouble we're hearing so much about recently.
Great, great. We have a couple questions. We have about 5 minutes. We can take a couple questions from the audience, and a couple people are running around with mics. So there you go.
Dan, you mentioned tools. What tools would you specifically recommend to make sure you don't get into those problems?
Well, forget about the problems. What tools do we use to make sure we have the culture we want, right? A lot of it is toned from the top. So Aaron, Dylan, and I, Dylan's our CFO, we each meet with every group of new boxers, and Aaron talks to them about vision, Dylan talks to them about how we create value, I talk to them about our culture and our values and how we want them to behave. You have to hire and fire based on your culture and your values, or they're not your values, they're just words on a wall. And you have to be willing to do it publicly, although respectfully of the people who are involved. And you've got to just have a drumbeat around this stuff, particularly if you don't want politics and internal competition and backstabbing, because that's how people succeed in bigger companies. You have to make it clear to them that it's unacceptable. You have to punish the behavior you don't want and reward the behavior you do want, and just be intentional and purposeful about it.
Who's that? Go ahead.
Thanks, guys. What are, in the early stages when sales is starting to take off, what are the 3 to 4 go-to-market metrics that you really looked at and tried to measure early on?
You have multiple one. I believe depending of if it's really early, it's probably the product fit, okay? So make sure if you sell to your first customer, stay close to that customer to understand exactly how they would use the technology, the benefit of the technology, and try to learn as much as you can. And then the bigger you are and more data-driven you have to be. I personally believe that back to your ability to scale the business, you have really to look at that, you know, at the minimum denominator possible there. It's at the sales level. It's okay, how I can size the territory of that salesperson. How much pipeline does he need? How long it takes to ramp up that salesperson. This is really what will enable you to scale your business at a highly efficient way. And it won't be right the first time. That means this is the iteration that you have to keep thinking about that all the time.
Output metrics that we cared intensely about: rep productivity, CAC to lifetime value, essentially, and magic number.
We didn't have any of those. I don't think any of those concepts, certainly not magic number, didn't exist. I started reading about that after I left Google. It's like, wow, that's pretty good concept. But I would say generally at the high end of the business, the large enterprise, it was very much the classic things that you all know. So I think it is important when you start to think about if you're selling to smaller businesses, how you sell and for us, we were all about how many touches. I mean, what percent of businesses of 5, 10, 100, 200 employees could we get onto our product with no touch at all? And of course, that was like intuitively how Google thought, right? So much of AdWords was built off people coming in self-serving, and the idea that you could build an enterprise product that did that. And so we got pretty methodical. And in the beginning, if you were more than 5 employees, you probably did talk to us, but we got it to a few hundred, where the majority of companies would actually be able to do everything they needed, pay the way they wanted to pay, which is, by the way, one of the worst miserable experiences at Google. If I had been able to use Zuora back then, we probably would be 5 times the size. We came this close, trust me. But in any case, I think really when you talk about the small end of the business, really like how can people self-serve? Can they get into the product? How do they convert to buying the product, et cetera?
Yeah. Back to the measure, I believe the churn, if you are a small company, the churn is probably the key one. That one is telling a lot. And then you have a full set of different other KPIs that we can help you to get all the metrics that you need to have if you want to follow up after.
Yeah, great. Do we have another question? Yeah, go ahead.
Dan, you mentioned 2 false starts in building a direct sales team. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
I can. I don't know that there's a lot of learning there. We hired the wrong guy once, which is a classic, small company mistake. I mean, the problem when you're 50 people is you can't get the person you want to take the job. So you're hiring the person you don't want by definition, and it's really easy to make a mistake there, and we made that mistake once. And then the second time, we were just too early. The product wasn't ready for the kind of customers that you needed to serve to put a field sales force in the field and have them make enough to pay them enough. I mean, if you think about the 5-to-1 sort of quota OTE ratio, if you can't get the quota high enough, you can't pay the OTE, you can't hire the people, and the market just wasn't there. So those were the 2 false starts. The third time, it was obvious that it was working quite quickly.
All right. Do we have one last question? Probably.
Thank you. So in reference to your international experience, so I'm just really curious to hear 2 things. What was the main trigger, or maybe couple, that led you to say, okay, now we're going international? And second, do you remember what was the range of your ARR at that time?
I can take that one. I believe I have a kind of unfair advantage here going international because I spend most of my time international. And actually, this is probably one of the most successful expansion strategy we had at Zuora. When we started to scale as an organization back to the year when we raised tons of money and we said we're going to scale. So we scale in all fronts. We wanted to double the number of salespeople in the US. We wanted to go to Europe. We opened Japan. And we retrenched it somehow in the US. But we kept, I will say, international. I'll say the hiring back to the people, when you are international, remember one thing. It's 9 hours time difference from here. So it's put even more pressure on having the right person. And the first person you hire in a country where you don't have any presence, you cannot hire only a salesperson. You need to find out a really deep person that can have the experience of having done that before, having the experience of building up an organization, and it's a rather very rare type of profile you have to go after. So I believe at Zuora I had a lot of network and relationship there. We did it extremely well. Today, we started to scale international back to 3 years ago. Today, it's 25 and sometimes even 35% of our total bookings. We moved from 5 million AER to $20 million AER. If you do it well, I believe it can really pay off and can help basically to fuel the level of growth that you're looking for.
Yeah.
We were about 100 million when we entered Europe and 200 million when we entered Japan. We had a list of probably 20 go-to-market expansion ideas that we would keep track of year to year, and every year we would put 2 or 3 or 4 bets down. And it was just a sequencing question. It was all about organizational capability for us. We were growing very quickly at that phase, 100% year over year. And it was hiring the right people and building the organizational capability was really challenging. So we couldn't afford to do too many things all at the same time. So we picked 2 or 3, and 1 year one of them was Europe, and 1 year one of them was Japan. And we haven't expanded beyond there yet in a significant way.
One of the things I just say, at Google, we were naturally far too many places almost overnight, so that's not a great. But one of the things I think we did quite well at Google is we had a notion of a scout in a new area. And this was sort of like a lot of things had to come together for Google to be there from a regulatory perspective, like a lot of things. And so sending literally, or finding a single individual who actually could establish presence, figure out who the right partners were, you know, what if there were legal framework issues, this and that, was an incredibly successful way that Google expanded into different parts of the world. And which is, you know, a lot less investment than trying to say, oh, we know the formula, we're going to drop these 8 people into this new territory overnight, and you all of a sudden have enormous expense, you have a bunch of people that don't know what they're doing, who haven't worked together, et cetera. So I think there is, you know, a better way to do it that you can explore and learn very quickly, but it does come down to finding the right individuals.
Great. All right, well, thank you very much. We're out of time. We've got to run with this one, but please join me in thanking Mark, Dave, and Dan. Thank you,